President Trump says he will not be attending the upcoming U.S. Supreme Court arguments deciding the legality of his global tariffs.
Without tariffs, without our being able to use tariffs freely, openly, and in every way, we would suffer tremendously from a national security standpoint. The national security of our country is at stake. It's the biggest, I think it's one of the biggest decisions in the history of the Supreme Court.
America's highest court is set to begin hearing arguments Wednesday, stemming from a lower court ruling that Trump overstepped his authority when he invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose most of his tariffs. The case will be closely watched here in Canada, which still faces the threat of an additional 10% tariff from Trump over Ontario's anti-tariff ad campaign. But the ruling won't affect tariffs that are already in place on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. All right, I want to bring in CTV's U.S. political analyst Eric Ham now with more. So Trump, Eric, had kind of left it up in the air. He was saying at one point that he might go and attend the hearings. He has changed his mind. Why do you think he did that?
Well, I think, like everything with Donald Trump, it's hyperbole. He wants to make clear that this is an important case, but also I think what he's trying to do is subtly influence the judges in their decision, which, of course, we know that's something that Donald Trump has a history of doing. In addition to that, we know that he has certainly relied on the national security implications of trade, which actually most courts say does give him some leeway in actually setting trade policy, even though the courts have made clear that when it comes to tariffs, Congress does have a huge role to play. But there is that one exception, and that is the national security component of tariffs. And that is what Donald Trump is leaning heavily on. And I think he's also trying to make clear, to telegraph at least to government lawyers when they argue this case, to certainly make that front and center. And that's what Donald Trump will certainly be relying on heavily in these arguments that take place on Wednesday.
So what's at stake for Trump, and what happens to all of the money that's been collected through tariffs? Will it be given back?
Well, again, that's the question we simply don't know. And I think not only is those resources that the government has taken in as a result of the tariffs, but also how does Donald Trump conduct basic foreign policy if now he cannot use his primary weapon, his primary cudgel, which is tariffs and the threat of tariffs. And we know he has used that very liberally, both with allies and opponents alike. And so without that, the Trump administration claims to have a contingency. Of course, we just don't know what that is, and more importantly, what that means. But if the Supreme Court, which has overwhelmingly ruled in Trump's favor since coming back into office, if they actually agree with the president, this just, again, it's another break in terms of the weight of balance moving from the Congress to the executive branch, and gives the president just even more enormous authority and power over the U.S. government.
So again, potentially, Eric, you're telling us redefining presidential authority here if it goes in his favor.
Yes, because it has always been sacrosanct that tariffs and trade policy does remain in the hands of Congress. And if the Supreme Court once again rules in Trump's favor, what we're now beginning to see is basically a runaway executive branch where most of the power, which initially rested with Congress, is now moving over to the executive branch. Now, we have seen that actually begin to happen going all the way back to FDR, but it's never been codified with ruling after ruling after ruling from the Supreme Court, which is what we're seeing take place now.
Eric Ham for us. Eric is our U.S. political analyst.